It begins, as all good tragedies do, with cold. Not the polite, nippy kind that encourages scarbs and cocoa, but the kind that seeps into the marrow, creeps under the skin, and whispers quietly that perhaps this is the year you simply won't make it to spring. For medieval women, winter was not a season, it was an adversary. A long, bone-gnawing siege waged by wind and ice against bodies already softened by exhaustion and childbirth and whatever passed for nutrition in a world where vegetables were both rare and suspicious. Forget the picture of the maiden by the hearth, her cheeks pink with health and her gowns spotless. The real medieval woman was closer to a battlefield medic in a collapsing barn. Her perfume? Smoke, sweat, and a hint of livestock. Her jewelry? Flea bolts. Her fashion statement? Layers. Endless, itchy, strategically grimy layers. Every year, as the first frost arrived, so too did a quiet sense of dread. The fields went pale, the wells froze over, and the air turned sharp enough to kill. Life shrank inward into the one-room home where families and animals huddled together, sharing breath, warmth, and the constant awareness that one wrong move, one lost fire, one spoiled pot of stew could turn survival into a story for the neighbors to gossip about at your funeral. There was no central heating. There were no hot baths. The closest thing to insulation was a wall made of mud and optimism. Medieval builders liked to pretend their wattle and daub creations were solid structures, but in truth they were more sieve than shelter. The wind came and went as it pleased, rattling the walls and rearranging everyone's morale. To live through a medieval winter was to become part of a group experiment in how much suffering the human body could endure without simply deciding to stop. And yet, somehow, they managed. Women, more than anyone, bore the brunt of it. They tended the fire that refused to stay lit, fed the family that refused to stay warm, and scrubbed floors that refused to stay solid. There were no days off. Survival itself was the day job. A medieval morning in January began not with sunlight, there wasn't any, but with the creak of frozen joints and the dull realization that the same nightmare was in fact real life. You'd wake beneath a mound of wool and straw, half asleep, half frozen, with a goat possibly standing on your foot. If you were lucky, there'd still be a faint glow from the hearth. If not, congratulations. You were about to discover the spiritual limits of patience while striking flint in the dark. The air inside the house was a study in textures, smoky, damp, and faintly barnyard. The floor, packed earth, offered the full tactile experience of frozen mud and straw, occasionally enriched by chicken contributions. The smell was indescribable, unless you've ever boiled cabbage in a chimney and left it there for a week. Outside, the world was silent. Snow muted the usual sounds of the village. No bells, no gossip, no laughter, just the occasional desperate scream from someone who'd stepped into a frozen puddle pretending to be solid ground. Inside, however, was another matter. A chorus of coughs, sneezes, and the slow, rhythmic groaning of wood contracting in the cold. Winter was the season of improvisation. You didn't fix problems, you negotiated with them. Roof leaking? Move the bed. Draft by the wall? Stuff it with moss. Chamber pot frozen? Congratulations, it's now a family ice sculpture. The miracle was not that anyone survived, but that they managed to do so while still finding the time to complain about it. And medieval women did complain, though mostly in mutters and sighs, the universal language of endurance. They knew the cold was coming. They knew what it meant. And yet, year after year, they dug in their heels, wrapped in rags, armed with a poker, glaring into the endless dark, and refused to let the winter win. Their world was small, but relentless. The days crawled by in shades of gray and brown, punctuated by the occasional thrill of a half-warm meal or a fleeting patch of sunlight that dared to peek through the oiled cloth window before retreating in shame. Hope was rationed, along with food, firewood, and sleep. Still, there was a grim kind of beauty in it. The slow rhythm of survival, the quiet heroism of endurance, a woman scraping frost from the inside of her wall, muttering about the saints, a mother coaxing life from the last ember in the hearth, whispering a prayer that was part plea, part curse, a grandmother reminding everyone that last winter was worse, though no one believed her. For the historian, it's easy to romanticize these scenes. The glow of firelight, the hum of life around the hearth, the stoic perseverance of the common folk. But strip away the poetry, and what remains is a portrait of sheer stubbornness. They survived because they had no choice, and because misery, like hunger, was easier to bear when shared. And so, as the wind howled across the moors and frost crept down the chimney, medieval women did what they always did. They endured. They built a fortress out of filth and willpower, outlasted the cold, and emerged in spring looking like survivors of a small, very personal apocalypse. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, but it was survival. And that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. If a medieval winter night was a battle, then morning was the grim aftermath. The battlefield strewn with bodies, blankets, and a general sense of betrayal. The rooster, that overconfident alarm clock of history, crowed just before dawn, not because it was morning, but because it was evil. Its cry split the silence, echoing across the frozen air, and somewhere beneath a pile of wool, a medieval woman contemplated the pros and cons of turning it into dinner. She did not wake so much as defrost. The body emerged from sleep reluctantly, like dough left too long in a cold oven. Fingers refused to bend, toes were more concept than reality. The first breath of morning tasted of ash and damp straw. She rolled over, trying to decide which side of her face was less frozen, and found herself staring into the unblinking eye of a chicken. The household, if it could be called that, began to stir, a slow, communal groan that sounded less like people greeting the day and more like the dead reconsidering resurrection. No one spoke at first. Words were a luxury. Breath condensed into mist. Conversation could wait until circulation returned. There was no privacy. The medieval family slept like sardines. Parents, children, babies, animals, and occasionally a visiting cousin who never left. Each morning began with the awkward ballet of untangling limbs and pretending not to notice who drooled on whom. Somewhere under the heap, a baby squawked, the dog stretched, and the father mumbled something about needing more firewood, the medieval equivalent of 5 more minutes. Rising from bed was an act of courage, not routine. The brave, or the bullied, were sent first to coax life from the hearth. Usually, that duty fell to the youngest or most expendable member of the family. A medieval coming-of-age story, how to relight the fire without losing your eyebrows. The woman of the house, if she wasn't the one shivering by the hearth herself, was already taking mental inventory. Was there still wood? Was the stew edible? Had the cow stopped breathing overnight? Each question carried the same answer, perhaps. The hearth was the heart of everything, and like all hearts, it had to be kept alive. The coals, if tended properly the night before, might still glow faintly beneath the ash. She knelt, breath visible, hands numb, blowing gently until the red returned. Too much air, and it died. Too little, and it sulked. It was a delicate relationship, one of mutual resentment and utter dependence. Behind her, the room was waking. Children coughed, the floor creaked, and someone complained about frost on their blanket. The draft had made its nightly rounds, finding new cracks to invade. From the ceiling, a slow drip of frost announced that the roof was once again failing in its only job. And yet, life went on. She stirred the ashes, fed the fire a few brittle sticks, and when the first flames licked upward, it was a small, defiant miracle. The room filled with orange light and smoke, mostly smoke, and the day could officially begin. Next came the morning rituals, if one can call them that. There was the obligatory inspection of fingers and toes, still attached, ideally, followed by a trip to the chamber pot, a communal experience that tested both balance and modesty. Privacy was theoretical, shame had long since frozen solid. If one dared venture outside, it was done quickly and with the grim determination of a condemned soul. The cold struck like a weapon, breath turned instantly to vapor, lashes crusted with frost, and the ground, a patchwork of ice and manure, offered the constant risk of humiliation. The privy, a leaning structure made of wood and good intentions, waited in the yard like a cruel joke. Its seat was frozen, its contents unspeakable, and yet it was still considered progress. Back indoors, warmth returned slowly, grudgingly. The first order of business was breakfast, a generous term for something that could barely be identified as food. A thin porridge, perhaps, or yesterday's stew reheated for the fourth time. Whatever it was hot, and that was all that mattered. As the fire grew steadier, so did the noise. The house filled with sound, children bickering, animals shifting, water dripping, wood popping, the medieval morning symphony. Through it all, the woman kept moving, stirring, scraping, folding, muttering. Every gesture carried the weight of survival. Her clothing, stiff from the night before, clung to her like damp parchment. Layers of linen and wool that never seemed to dry, only alternate between wet and stiff. She tied her headscarf, rubbed her arms, and prepared for the long list of chores that began with "don't freeze" and ended with "try again tomorrow." Outside, the world remained indifferent. The sun, when it bothered to appear, rose weakly through clouds that looked like old milk. The air smelled of wood smoke and despair. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, marking the hour, not that it mattered. Time in winter was elastic, stretching and sagging like an old tunic. The medieval morning was not about energy, it was about endurance. There were no schedules, no alarms, no morning affirmations, only the slow rhythm of existence. Feed the fire, feed the children, feed yourself if there's anything left. And yet, amid the misery, there was order. A small, stubborn dignity. The woman who rose before dawn to scrape frost from the window and coax life from dying coals did so not out of hope, but out of habit, the kind of habit that becomes its own form of courage. When historians write of the resilience of medieval peasant life, they're really describing this, the quiet heroism of getting up when everything in the world seems to design to keep you down. By the time the morning's work was done, the ashes cleared, the stew bubbling, the frost beaten back for another hour, the medieval woman had already fought her daily battle, and there were still 12 more hours of daylight to survive. It was not glorious, nor poetic. It was simply life. And in winter, that was victory enough. To understand how medieval women survived winter, one must first understand the enemy. Not the weather itself, but the building that stood between them and it. The medieval peasant's home was an act of hope disguised as architecture. It was constructed not to keep out the cold, but to politely delay its entry. Think of it less as a house and more as a suggestion of one, a wooden skeleton held together by mud, animal dung, and stubbornness. The technical term was wattle and daub. Wattle, the woven lattice of sticks that gave the walls their shape. Daub, the mud, straw, and animal dung mixture plastered over it to fill in the gaps. Together, they formed a structure that looked solid until the wind blew, at which point it began to hum, rattle, and occasionally shed bits of itself like a molting animal. For a medieval woman, this wasn't just a home, it was a project that never ended. The walls cracked, the roof leaked, the floor, well, calling it a floor was optimistic. It was compacted dirt, worn smooth by feet, hoofs, and occasional spilled stew. When it rained, it became mud again. When it snowed, it became an indoor glacier. You swept it daily not to clean it, but to remind it who was in charge. The roof, if you could call it that, was thatch. Dried reeds, piled high, stuffed tight, and left to rot in peace. It was both insulation and ecosystem. Birds nested in it, mice tunneled through it, and occasionally a family of weasels moved in rent-free. In summer, it smelled like a compost heap. In winter, it leaked in precisely 7 places, no matter how many patches you made. Medieval women spent as much time rearranging buckets as they did cooking. The wind, ever curious, found its way through every crack, hole, and innocent-looking knot in the wood. Drafts were not visitors, they were residents, loud, opinionated ones. They slipped under doors, whistled through the rafters, and aimed specifically for the back of your neck like a petty god with a grudge. To fight them, women stuffed rags. If the medieval home was a fortress built from mud and desperation, then the fire was its temperamental deity, equal parts savior, tyrant, and trickster. It demanded constant worship, frequent sacrifices, and, occasionally, a human offering in the form of scorched fingers or singed eyebrows. The hearth was more than a fireplace. It was the axis around which the entire world turned. Without it, there was no light, no warmth, no cooked food, and frankly, no hope. The fire was life distilled into flickering form, but it was also a living menace. It smoked when it pleased, burned when it wished, and died whenever you looked away for more than a moment. Every medieval woman knew the sound of a dying fire, that weak hiss of surrender, followed by the slow fade of warmth across the room. It was the soundtrack of despair. The day's chores might wait, the children might whine, but the fire demanded immediate attention. If it went out overnight, you were not waking to a new morning. You were waking to a day-long ordeal of humiliation, shivering, and frantic flint striking. Starting a new fire was an ordeal. No matches, no lighter fluid, just a flint, some dry kindling, a rare miracle, and the kind of patience only found in saints and sleep-deprived mothers. The process involved crouching in front of the hearth, muttering prayers to Saint Brigid, and blowing gently until your face turned blue. It was not so much an act of skill as a negotiation with nature. When the embers finally caught, it felt like divine intervention. You fed the flame carefully. Too little wood, and it sulked. Too much, and it roared up like an insulted dragon. You learned to read its moods, to coax rather than command. The fire was not owned. It was appeased.
Even when burning properly, it was treacherous. Smoke filled the room like a permanent fog bank, stinging the eyes, coating the lungs, and giving every meal a flavor best described as woodsy despair. The smoke was supposed to rise through the roof hole, but in practice, it preferred to stay, swirling around the rafters before drifting leisurely into everyone's face. Children learned early to crawl close to the ground, where the air was marginally breathable. Adults developed the resigned cough of lifelong arson victims. Visitors didn't comment. They couldn't speak between wheezes. And yet, for all its inconveniences, the hearth was sacred. It was the beating heart of the household, both literal and symbolic. Every major life event, births, deaths, meals, confessions, unfolded beside it. A medieval woman could measure her life in fires, the one she lit, the one she saved, and the one that nearly took her eyebrows in the winter of 52. At night, before anyone dared sleep, came the most important ritual, banking the fire. This was a delicate operation, part science, part superstition. The goal was to bury the coals under a layer of ash so they'd smolder through the night without going out completely. Too thin a layer, and the embers died. Too thick, and they suffocated. There was a perfect middle ground, known only to the experienced, the blessed, and the occasionally lucky. The house would grow quiet as the woman of the hearth knelt before the coals, poking and patting with the precision of a surgeon. Children watched in reverent silence. Husbands pretended to help. A few muttered charms or crossed themselves for good measure, because if the fire failed overnight, there'd be no breakfast, no warmth, and possibly no family left by dawn. Should the worst happen, the morning humiliation was immense. Fetching fire from a neighbor's hearth was a walk of shame unlike any other. You'd arrive at their door clutching a pot or a cabbage leaf, mumbling excuses about bad wood or a mischievous draft, while they smirked knowingly. Fire was communal property, but pride was not. Fuel was its own battle. Every log, every stick represented labor. Firewood had to be chopped, carried, dried, and guarded because there was never enough of it. Those living near forests were lucky, though not so lucky that they could take wood freely. The trees belonged to the Lord, and poaching a branch could mean a fine, a whipping, or, in particularly dramatic cases, execution. So, medieval women became masters of improvisation. Anything burnable was fair game. Broken stools, old shoes, fences that fell over by accident. Dung, once again, made an appearance, dried, crumbled, and added to the flames. It didn't smell pleasant, but it kept the house warm, and no one was in a position to be fussy. Keeping the fire alive was more than a domestic task. It was a moral duty. In every puff of smoke and crackle of wood lay the promise of survival. When the flames flickered low, so did morale. When they blazed bright, hope returned, along with a renewed sense of purpose and slightly roasted eyebrows. And the fire wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Many medieval people believed that each hearth contained a spirit, a kind of guardian flame. To neglect it was to invite misfortune. To feed it was to honor life itself. So the medieval woman became both priest and servant to her domestic god, performing daily rituals of warmth, ash, and perseverance. Even the smoke had meaning. It rose toward heaven, carrying prayers and curses alike. It stung the eyes, but it also reminded everyone that they were still alive, still breathing, still burning. When the snow piled high outside and the wind howled like a ghost with grievances, the family would draw close to the fire, sharing warmth and silence. The flames cast long, trembling shadows on the soot-stained walls, painting their faces in flickering gold. For a few moments, the house didn't feel like a prison of mud and misery. It felt like defiance made visible, because that was what the fire truly represented. Not comfort, not luxury, but rebellion. A single spark against a world determined to freeze it out. And every woman who kept that spark alive was, in her own quiet way, a warrior.
If the hearth was the heart of the home, the bed was its digestive system, a vast, tangled mass of warmth, noise, and questionable odors, where everything ended up eventually. In the medieval imagination, beds were not symbols of comfort or privacy. They were pits of necessity, nests of straw, wool, and shared body heat where entire families collapsed like weary livestock. The modern notion of sleeping alone would have seemed not only absurd, but dangerous. Heat was survival, and survival meant togetherness, the kind that left bruises. A typical peasant bed, if you could call it that, was a wooden frame stuffed with straw. The straw was rarely fresh and often alive. It poked, crunched, and sometimes scurried. Changing it was a biannual event, usually timed with Lent or pestilence. Medieval straw was less bedding and more ecological partnership. The mattress, called a palliasse, was a lumpy sack sewn from old cloth and filled with the detritus of last year's harvest, oat stalks, barley husks, maybe some mice. Over this went a threadbare blanket or cloak, and over that went everyone. A family of 6 might share a single bed, while guests, animals, and anyone unlucky enough to visit during a storm were simply added to the pile. Babies were wedged in the middle, theoretically safe from drafts and crushing. Parents, children, and sometimes the family pig occupied the rest, arranged according to rank, health, or how fast they managed to claim a spot. There was an unspoken hierarchy: the elderly nearest the fire, the children in the center, the parents somewhere in between, and the perpetually unlucky at the outer edges where the wall sweated cold and mold crept like frostbite in slow motion. No one wanted the wall side. It was where blankets went to die and toes went numb. At night, the room transformed into a kind of human lasagna, alternating layers of wool, flesh, and size. The air grew thick with the scent of smoke, damp straw, and mortal fatigue. Someone always snored, someone always coughed, and someone, usually the chicken, refused to settle down. Privacy was non-existent. Changing clothes, scratching, whispering secrets, all of it happened under the communal gaze. Medieval decency was a practical concept. You turned your head and pretended. If modesty had a season, winter wasn't it. For women, the bed was both refuge and battlefield. It was where they gave birth, nursed babies, endured illness, and occasionally plotted the day's revenge. It was also where they negotiated with the night. Please, not too cold, not too damp, not too much snoring. The night rarely listened. To modern sensibilities, the idea of sleeping shoulder to shoulder with half your family and a goat may sound revolting, but to a medieval woman, it was simply efficient. Body heat was the only reliable form of insulation. Each person was a tiny furnace, and the closer you packed them, the better your chances of waking up with all your extremities intact. There was, however, a dark side to this intimacy. The family bed was not just warm, it was alive. Fleas, lice, and the occasional beetle thrived in the straw. They were not pests, they were roommates. Scratching was a social activity, and though medieval people were experts at ignoring discomfort, no one slept entirely in peace. The noise was an ordeal. Snoring,
coughing, muttering, the creak of the bed, the lowing of the cow outside the door, a cacophony of survival. If silence ever fell, it was cause for concern. Silence meant someone had stopped breathing, or the fire had gone out, and both were equally alarming. Despite the chaos, there was something oddly tender about it all. In the flickering glow of the dying fire, faces softened, children dreamed. The mother, half awake, half frozen, listened to the steady rhythm of shared breathing, a sound that meant for one more night everyone had made it. The modern world may have blankets and heating, but it lacks that particular intimacy, the sense that life itself was something you held in your arms, pressed between you and the cold. By dawn, the room would smell like smoke and humanity, the straw flattened, the air sour. People would rise stiff and pale, shaking out their cloaks, scratching their necks, and pretending the night hadn't happened. The bed, such as it was, would be left unmade, not out of laziness, but superstition. Disturbing it might disturb whatever spirits had allowed everyone to wake up alive. And so it stood, that humble pile of straw and fabric, the throne room of survival. It was not pretty, it was not private, but it was warm, and in winter, that was the only luxury that mattered. Because in the medieval world, comfort was not the absence of suffering, it was the art of sharing it.
The floor, already dirt, absorbed whatever the animals contributed. A few handfuls of straw tossed daily served as both bedding and deodorizer, creating geological layers of filth. Every so often, when the smell became unbearable or the floor achieved sentience, the family would dig out the worst of it and call it spring cleaning. Yet despite the chaos, this living arrangement had its logic. The animals stayed safe from predators, the family stayed warm, and everyone shared the same bacterial destiny. It was communal living at its most literal, a medieval precursor to co-housing, only louder, smellier, and significantly more likely to step on your face. Children grew up treating the livestock as family. They named the goats, whispered secrets to the cow, and occasionally tried to ride the pig. Death, when it came, was practical, not sentimental. A creature that had warmed your house for months might one day become dinner, and you would think it, briefly, before turning its bones into soup and its hide into next year's shoes. In the mornings, the animals were led out into the brittle daylight, leaving behind warmth, moisture, and memories. The house would steam faintly, as if exhaling after a long night. Women swept the straw, stirred the ashes, and braced themselves for another day of smoke and manure. It was not glamorous, it was not pleasant, but it was efficient. In the delicate arithmetic of medieval survival, every creature counted. The cow gave milk, the goat gave mischief, the chicken gave eggs, and all of them gave heat. In their absence, the silence was unbearable. No lowing, no clucking, no sound but the creak of wood and the whistle of wind through the cracks. For a medieval woman, that silence meant danger. The fire was low, the cold was winning, and the house itself was starting to remember the taste of frost. So she called the animals back in, again and again, every night, all winter, because warmth, no matter how smelly or chaotic, was worth the price. And when spring finally came and the animals returned to their pastures, the house felt impossibly empty. It still stank, it still smoked, but it was quiet, too quiet. For the first few nights, medieval women often complained that they couldn't sleep without the sounds of their cows breathing beside them. It was like missing a heartbeat, an odd, lingering silence where life used to be. And that was the strange poetry of medieval winter, that comfort came not from solitude,
but from company, no matter how many hooves it had. Medieval winter fashion was not a matter of taste. It was a matter of survival. A constant negotiation between temperature, dignity, and smell. Forget silk gowns, jeweled girdles, and delicate veils. Those were for illuminated manuscripts and people who could afford servants to hold their sleeves out of the mud. For everyone else, especially women in the countryside, winter clothing was less ensemble and more armor. The guiding principle was simple. Put on everything you own, and then put on one more thing. The first layer was linen, theoretically clean, practically not. Linen chemises worn next to the skin were meant to absorb sweat and dirt, so the outer garments didn't have to. In practice, this meant that by February, the chemise had achieved both sentience and historical significance. Washing it required an act of God, or at least a day above freezing. Over the linen came wool, always wool. Thick, itchy, and endlessly useful, wool was the medieval woman's best friend and worst enemy. It repelled water, trapped heat, and smelled faintly of whatever sheep it came from, which was a small price to pay for the luxury of not dying. A typical winter outfit might include a wool kirtle, a second wool kirtle, a cloak, an apron, 2 shawls, and possibly a blanket repurposed as outerwear. Fasteners were optional. Most garments were tied, pinned, or simply hoped into place. The silhouette was less animated maiden and more animated laundry pile. Hats and hoods were essential. Heat escaped through the head, and modesty demanded coverage. A linen coif tied under the chin, topped with a wool hood, created a look that could only be described as medieval astronaut. Scarves were wrapped, tucked, and sometimes frozen in place. Gloves were rare. Most people simply kept their hands busy enough to prevent frostbite. In the worst weather, they simply stayed indoors, which, given the company of livestock, was not necessarily an improvement. Shoes were another form of punishment. Leather, untreated and thin, offered about as much insulation as a damp biscuit. Women stuffed them with straw or wool scraps, or wrapped their feet in cloth before pulling the shoes on. In the worst weather, they simply stayed indoors, which, given the company of livestock, was not necessarily an improvement. Color in theory existed. Natural dyes gave shades of brown, green, or faded red, but winter wore everything down to the same shade of smoke. The medieval wardrobe was a monochrome study in earth tones and resignation. And then there was the smell. Bathing in winter was less an act of hygiene and more a flirtation with death. Water froze, fires cost wood, and nakedness was an invitation to pneumonia. So the layers stayed on for weeks, sometimes months. Linen absorbed sweat. Wool absorbed the rest, and everything absorbed smoke. By midwinter, the average outfit had become a historical archive of human suffering. Yet medieval women took pride in their appearance, or rather in their ability to appear functional. Clothing was patched endlessly, repaired with scraps, stitched with care. A well-mended sleeve or a neatly rewoven stocking was a quiet badge of competence. When clothing did wear out beyond repair, it was repurposed into rags, bags, baby wrappings, or in extreme cases, insulation stuffed into wall cracks. Nothing was wasted. The medieval woman was a one-woman recycling industry. In wealthier households, things looked only slightly better. Layers were finer, fabric softer, but comfort remained elusive. A lady might own fur-lined cloaks, squirrel, rabbit, or even ermine, but her drafty stone manor was no less cold than a peasant's hut. She only had the advantage that she could afford more candles and complain about it in Latin. Fur, of course, was coveted. It was warm, luxurious, and usually alive with fleas. Fox, marten, cat, even rat, if one was desperate. A fur-lined hood was the medieval equivalent of a heated blanket, though it occasionally tried to bite you first. For all their suffering, medieval women dressed with a kind of fierce practicality. Every garment had purpose: warmth, modesty, durability. Ornament was for summer and church. Winter was for survival. Still, even amid the smoke and rags, vanity persisted. A splash of color in a woven belt, a bit of embroidery along a hem, small gestures of defiance against the gray tyranny of the season. To decorate oneself, even faintly, was to declare, "I may be freezing, but I refuse to vanish." And therein lie the strange dignity of medieval fashion. Beneath all the filth and hardship, each layer told a story of work, endurance, and stubborn pride. The clothes didn't just keep the cold out, they held a life together. By March, when the thaw began, and the outer garments were peeled off like the bark of an ancient tree, there was relief, laughter, and occasionally fainting. The smell, released at last, could drive animals from the yard. But for a few glorious weeks, there was the sensation of lightness, of air touching skin, of fabric that didn't crackle with frost. And as women swept, mended, and aired out the winter's wardrobe, they did so knowing that in a few months they'd repeat it all again. Because in the medieval world, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about looking alive.
Let's talk about filth. It is fashionable in modern times to think of medieval people as dirty because they didn't know any better. But that's not quite true. They did know. They just didn't have any other options. In winter, water was both a luxury and a death trap. Wells froze, rivers iced over, and anyone foolish enough to wash head to toe risked becoming an anecdote about pneumonia. The medieval woman understood this perfectly. Cleanliness was admirable in theory. In practice, it was fatal. And so they developed a philosophy that could only have been forged in the frost. Dirt, properly applied, was a form of protection. Smoke, soot, sweat, and grease. These were not just byproducts of life, but insulation. A thin layer of grime on the skin helped trap warmth. Soot acted like primitive sunscreen and allegedly repelled insects. And body odor? Well, that was simply proof that you were still alive. Bathing in winter was limited to what was absolutely necessary: hands, face, and maybe feet if you wanted to feel extravagant. Even that was done in cold or lukewarm water, splashed sparingly from a basin near the fire. The rest of the body remained heroically untouched until the thaw. Soap existed, yes, but not in any comforting sense. Early medieval soap was made from lye and animal fat, a combination so caustic that it could strip both dirt and dignity. Women often used ash or sand as exfoliant instead, emerging red, raw, and slightly cleaner. Instead of water baths, people turned to smoke baths. This was exactly what it sounds like: standing or sitting near the hearth, allowing the smoke to waft through your clothes and hair, killing lice and dampening the more aggressive odors of existence. The process left you coughing, teary-eyed, and smelling faintly of roast, but it worked, at least according to medieval standards of better. Hair care was an art form of its own. In winter, hair was rarely washed, merely managed. Women combed it daily, not for beauty, but for pest control. Combs were fine-toothed and often carved from bone,
designed for the noble task of delousing. Some added a sprinkle of ashes or herbs to the scalp, which, if nothing else, provided a pleasant distraction from the itching. Clothing, as previously mentioned, absorbed most of the battle. The chemise, the linen layer closest to the skin, soaked up oil and sweat until it could practically walk on its own. But linen had a magical property. When beaten in cold water and dried by the fire, it somehow became almost clean again, almost being the key term. The smell of a medieval household in winter defies polite language. It was an ecosystem of odors: smoke, livestock, unwashed humanity, damp wool, and whatever was currently fermenting in the cooking pot. To modern sensibilities, it would be unbearable. To the medieval nose, it was simply Tuesday. And make no mistake, people did notice smell. They just calibrated differently. A person who reeked of illness, rot, or moral decay was shunned. But the ordinary musk of survival, wood smoke, sweat, and cabbage, was the scent of life itself. Ironically, this pervasive filth may have offered a kind of protection. Modern historians have speculated that the layers of grime, smoke, and oil created a physical barrier against insects and perhaps even infection. The medieval woman unwittingly had developed the first antibacterial defense made of despair. There were, of course, exceptions. Monastic women and nuns, with access to warm water and enclosed spaces, bathed more regularly. Nobles, too, might indulge in occasional baths perfumed with herbs or milk, rituals of cleanliness that were less about hygiene and more about social theater. But even they, come winter, faced the same cold reality. Bathe too often, and you risk joining the saints sooner than planned. When spring finally arrived, the first proper wash of the year was a religious experience. Water, no longer murderous, was poured and splashed with reckless joy. Entire families scrubbed, scraped, and combed as if shedding an old identity. For a few fleeting days, the air smelled of soapwort and redemption. Then, inevitably, the cycle began anew. Dirt returned, lice multiplied, and the smoke once again became perfume. But for all its filth, medieval life was not careless. It was adaptive. The grime, the soot, the acrid layers of smoke, these were not signs of ignorance, but of grim practicality. They were the human body's winter coat, the poor woman's armor against a world that never stopped biting. To live unwashed was not to live in shame. It was to say, I have outlasted the cold, and I am still here. And that, in its own foul way, was beautiful.
Winter cooking in the Middle Ages was not a matter of taste. It was a slow negotiation between what hadn't rotted yet and what might, with luck, not kill you. By November, the garden was a graveyard. The bright greens of summer were gone, replaced by a few defiant root vegetables clinging to life like stubborn peasants at tax time. Turnips, parsnips, onions, the holy trinity of edible boredom, were the backbone of every winter meal. Cabbage twined in occasionally, mostly to remind everyone that flavor was optional. Grain was precious. Oats, rye, or barley made into porridge formed breakfast, lunch, and something that claimed to be dinner. Wheat was for the wealthy. Peasants ate what they could grind without tears. Bread was dense, gray, and filled with more husk than hope. If you could hammer a nail with it, it was probably ready.
The main dish of every day was pottage, a stew that never truly began or ended. It simmered perpetually on the hearth, absorbing whatever ingredients happened to fall into it. Today, cabbage and barley. Tomorrow, cabbage, barley, and a hint of yesterday. If someone had the fortune or tragedy of a slaughtered animal, the bones joined the pot, lending it a faint whisper of protein. You could tell a family's luck by how opaque their pottage looked. Clear broth meant bad fortune. Cloudy meant good eating. Salted meat was a treasure, though meat could mean anything with legs. A scrap of bacon was not food, it was currency. Women rationed it like gold, slicing slivers so thin they were practically theological concepts. Fish, when available, was pickled, dried, or simply regretted. Herring, that gray messenger of Lent, haunted the middle-aged diet like a ghost that refused to leave. Fermentation was a survival art. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut. Milk soured into cheese. Ale replaced water because water could and often did make you ill. Even children drank beer. Thin, weak, and safer than the well. A medieval woman spent half her life brewing something not out of luxury but necessity. A well-kept ale could keep her family hydrated, fed, and faintly cheerful all winter. The smell of malt and smoke was the closest thing to comfort most kitchens ever knew. Fresh fruit? Gone by Christmas. Apples stored in straw lasted longest, though they tended to shrivel into small, judgmental faces by February. Anything green after New Year's was either dried herbs or witchcraft. Protein was improvisational. If a rat ventured too close to the fire, no one asked questions. Birds, rabbits, even hedgehogs occasionally made surprise appearances at supper. A hedgehog, once despined and baked in clay, tasted reportedly like chicken with opinions. Waste nothing. That was the rule, the creed, the culinary religion of winter. Seasoning was a myth. Pepper was imported and cost more than your house. Herbs were long dead. Garlic, if you had it, was both medicine and social weapon. Most dishes were flavored with smoke, despair, and the faint metallic tang of the cooking pot. Iron and sorrow. That was the medieval umami. And yet, within this grim cuisine, women worked small miracles. They stretched, preserved, and reinvented. A clever hand could turn barley water and onions into something resembling nourishment. Bread crusts became thickening agents, bones became stock, and every last scrap was coaxed into usefulness. Medieval cookery was less about recipes and more about endurance with a spoon. Feasts were rare but ecstatic. At Christmas or a saint's day, the monotony broke. Roasted goose if fortune smiled, pies stuffed with whatever moved slower than the cook. For a few brief hours, bellies filled, cheeks warmed, and laughter echoed louder than the wind. Then the leftovers returned to the pot, and the cycle resumed. By late winter, creativity gave way to desperation. The stores were low, the beer was sour, and the pottage had achieved sentience. People gnawed old bones for flavor and prayed for Lent to end. A medieval woman in February was less a cook than an alchemist, turning frost and fatigue into sustenance through sheer willpower. When at last spring crept in, bringing greens and the first tender shoots, the taste of fresh food was a revelation, a reminder that life could, occasionally, taste of something other than cabbage. But she never forgot the lessons of winter, how to stretch a meal until it begged for mercy, how to find dignity in a bowl of gray stew, how to feed hope itself. Because in the medieval kitchen, survival was the only spice that mattered. For the medieval woman, winter was not a season of rest. It was a full-time occupation, one that paid nothing and threatened to kill you if you underperformed. The word chore feels too small, too polite for what filled her days. These were not tasks. They were acts of war against entropy, filth, and the endless damp conspiracy of the season itself. Every morning began with the same negotiation: fire, water, animals, family, sanity, in that order. Each demanded attention, and none ever took later as an answer. Fetching water was the medieval cardio routine. The well might be 50 yards away, or half a mile, or worse, frozen. Ice thickened overnight, forming a glittering insult atop the only drinkable supply in the world. A woman, armed with a bucket and a stick, would march out before dawn, break the surface, and scoop what she could before it refroze. Sometimes she slipped, sometimes the rope did, sometimes the bucket cracked from cold. There were no good days, only fewer disasters. And if you thought that was the end of it, no. The water had to be heated, guarded, and portioned out like holy oil. A pot for cooking, a basin for washing, a splash for drinking, a drop for mercy. Every drop had to be earned twice, once from the earth, once from the fire. Winter mud was the medieval background noise, omnipresent, undefeated. When the ground wasn't frozen solid, it was a soup of sludge. Paths disappeared, doorways filled with muck. Every footstep brought the outdoors inside, clinging to shoes, skirts, and dignity alike. Peasants trudged through it daily, dragging carts, fetching food, feeding animals. The floor, already dirt, simply absorbed more of itself. Sweeping was a gesture of optimism, nothing more. Women swept anyway, not because it mattered, but because the alternative was surrender. The cows had to be milked, the goats had to be convinced, and the chickens had to be found, all before breakfast. Each animal came with its own temperament and vendetta. Cows resented cold hands. Goats resented everything. Chickens were chaos made flesh. Every task carried the risk of bites, kicks, or emotional breakdowns. But the work had to be done. Milk spoiled if left too long. Eggs froze in their nests. A medieval woman learned to move quickly and swear quietly. Washing clothes was a crime against reason. Imagine plunging your hands into icy water, scrubbing linen with sand or lye, and hanging it on a line where it froze into crisp, elegant sculptures of suffering. Laundry didn't dry, it hardened. You could break it over your knee like a biscuit. And yet laundry happened, because even in a world held together by dirt, there were limits to human tolerance. Once in a while, the chemises were boiled, the rags beaten, the children dunked, all to restore a fleeting sense of order before entropy reclaimed it. The fire never rested. Keeping it alive was a second, eternal job. Wood had to be split, carried, stacked, and guarded like treasure. Damp wood hissed and sulked. Dry wood burned too fast. Every stick was a decision. Every ember a negotiation. Women tended the fire as they cooked, stirred, and spun, feeding it with one hand while wielding a ladle with the other. A moment's neglect and the fire died. Then came the cold, the shame, and the long march to borrow a coal from the neighbor who would definitely talk about it later. Winter was spinning season. When the chores were done, meaning the family was still alive, women sat by the fire, spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, or mending the garments that hadn't yet fallen apart. The sound of the spinning wheel was the heartbeat of winter evenings, steady, patient, endless. Threads twisted, cloth grew, and the illusion of progress soothed the weary mind. The hands never stopped, because if they did, you started thinking about the cold, and that way lay madness. Meals were sparse, sleep was short, and warmth was conditional. Joints stiffened, skin cracked, and fingernails turned the color of iron. Women learned to work through numbness, to ignore pain, and to treat exhaustion as a natural state of being. Their hands told the story. Calloused, red, split from cold, strong enough to wrestle the season itself. Those hands fed families, birthed children, stitched wounds, stirred stews, scrubbed filth, and held the world together, not gracefully, but effectively. Through it all, Faith was the glue that kept sanity from freezing solid. Prayers were whispered as fires were lit, as buckets cracked, as children coughed through the night. Whether to God, saints, or simply to the stubbornness of survival itself, every act carried a trace of devotion. And yet, for all the misery, there was rhythm. A grim, unbroken rhythm that marked the passing of time when the sun refused to. Work was time, time was work, and both meant life. By the time the day's chores ended, if such a thing could ever be said, the medieval woman was little more than smoke and bone. She collapsed by the fire, wrapped in wool and fatigue, surrounded by the quiet breathing of animals and children. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen fields, battering the walls, testing their strength. Inside, she exhaled, long and low, like someone daring the world to try again tomorrow. And it always did. But so did she.
The deeper winter sank its teeth into the medieval world, the more creative, or desperate, people became in the pursuit of warmth. A modern person has radiators, blankets, and electric blankets. A medieval woman had rocks, hay, and unverified optimism. The simplest solution was also the most elegant. Heat a stone and hope for the best. Women placed large, flat rocks or bricks near the hearth until they glowed faintly with warmth. Not too long, or they cracked. Not too little, or they mocked you with their uselessness. Wrapped in rags or shoved into a small sack, these stones were tucked under bedding before nightfall. If you were lucky, the rock stayed warm until midnight. If you weren't, it burned a hole through your blanket and gave you a medieval tattoo in the shape of regret. The stones were reused nightly, their edges darkened by soot, their surfaces polished by centuries of hope. Archaeologists find them today, smooth and blackened, the ghosts of small domestic victories. In a world without insulation, hay was everything. Bedding, roofing, and in moments of genius, heating. The hay box was an early thermal cooker, a wooden chest or large basket packed with hay or straw. A pot of boiling stew was placed inside and covered. The hay trapped the heat, keeping the food warm for hours. It wasn't just cooking, it was a miracle of efficiency. The same principle was occasionally used for comfort. Small hay-stuffed bags tucked at the foot of the bed, acting as rustic space heaters. They smelled faintly of livestock, and often were livestock, but they worked. In wealthier homes, there was the bed warmer, a small brass pan with a long handle filled with embers, slid between the sheets moments before bedtime. It sounded idyllic. It was not. More than one bed, and more than one noble rear end caught fire thanks to this invention. Servants learned to move quickly, shaking the pan like a rattle to spread the heat without leaving scorch marks or flames. In some households, the pan was replaced with a linen bag filled with ashes or heated grain, safer but far less theatrical. In both cases, the message was clear. A warm bed was worth the risk of spontaneous combustion. When the fire failed, women turned to nature's other insulators. Sheepskins, rabbit furs, and old feathers were layered beneath and above bedding, creating cocoons of animal warmth. If you couldn't afford fur, you made do with straw, moss, or even dried leaves. The medieval equivalent of stuffing your bed with autumn. It wasn't comfortable, but it was effective. The bed rustled, the straw poked, and occasionally something alive wriggled out, but the cold stayed mostly at bay. A trade worth making. In poorer homes, even worn-out clothing found new purpose, shredded, layered, and sewn into crude quilts. Each patch carried a story. A wedding cloak, a child's outgrown tunic, a dead husband's coat. Comfort and memory intertwined, stitched by necessity. Warmth also came from within, or so they claimed. Ale was the medieval answer to everything, and in winter it was served hot and spiced.
a brew of comfort and mild delusion. Wine, if available, was mulled with herbs or cinnamon, an imported miracle for those rich enough to afford it. For the peasantry, there was hot milk, or more accurately, hot liquid resembling milk, often flavored with whatever was handy, onions, bread, or sheer defiance. Some swore by more eccentric methods: a warm stone under the feet, a heated onion in the hands. One 14th century manuscript even recommends keeping a live chicken near your chest for warmth and humor. The humor was mostly on the chicken's part. At night, the family bed, already a mess of limbs and livestock, became the final fortress. People huddled close, wrapped in every scrap of cloth available, breathing each other's warmth in slow, smoky rhythm. Some stuffed straw inside their tunics for extra insulation. Others slept with dogs at their feet, hairhounds, living bed warmers with tails. Children were wrapped in cloaks, then blankets, then parental arms. It was primitive, uncomfortable, and occasionally suffocating, but it worked. The medieval woman understood what physicists later confirmed. Warmth was not created, only shared. There came nights too cold for logic, nights when the fire refused to catch, when even the rocks cooled too quickly, when frost crept across the walls like a slow invasion. On those nights, people simply endured. They curled tighter, prayed louder, and waited for morning. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. But the remarkable thing is how often they did. Because for all their crude methods and perilous inventions, medieval women turned scarcity into science technology. They transformed hay, smoke, and soot into survival technology centuries ahead of its time. The quiet genius of people who had nothing but refused to give up. By dawn, the fire would smolder again, the rocks reheated, the straw shaken out. The house would steam faintly from breath and effort. Another night survived, another victory in the long war against winter. Warmth, in the end, was not just temperature, it was triumph.
It is one thing to keep the body alive through winter. It is quite another to keep the mind from following the sun and never coming back. For months on end, the landscape offered nothing but gray. Gray sky, gray mud, gray food. Time blurred, daylight was rationed. In such conditions, even the strongest spirit began to creak. The medieval woman knew this intimately. She had no words for seasonal depression, but she lived it every year. And yet, somehow, she stayed sane, or at least functionally so, through a heady mixture of faith, fear, and gallows humor. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't an optional accessory. It was the operating system of daily life. Each sound from the church bell marked not just the hours, but survival checkpoints. Matins, lauds, vespers. Time was carved by prayer, the way frost carved the fields. For a medieval woman, faith was not abstract. It was domestic. Each candle lit, each loaf blessed, each whispered Ave Maria was a small truce with the cold. Saints were less distant icons than neighbors with influence. If the fire refused to light, you appealed to Saint Bridget. If frost killed your vegetables, Saint Agnes might listen. If your husband slipped on the ice and met the Lord, well, at least Saint Anne would understand. The church gave rhythm to chaos. The Mass was warmth, light, and community, a moment when everyone gathered, steamed gently, and pretended life was bearable. Faith didn't banish hardship, it organized it. Where faith ended, superstition filled the cracks, quite literally. Women stuffed herbs into door frames to keep out evil spirits and, coincidentally, drafts. Iron nails were driven above cradles to ward off frost demons. Bread was marked with a cross before baking, not just to bless it,
but to remind the doe who was in charge. The line between religion and superstition was blurry, but no one cared as long as it worked. If hanging garlic over the door stopped illness, or at least distracted the goats, it was considered good theology. The year's calendar of saints provided comfort through predictability. Candlemas, St. Blaise's Day, Shrovetide, markers of progress through the darkness. If you've reached St. Benedict, you'll likely reach spring. It was less a proverb than a promise. And sometimes, when prayers failed, there was always the charm. Whispered spells, little rhymes learned from grandmothers. Fire, stay bright, frost, take flight, muttered as the coals were covered for the night. Silly? Perhaps. But in a world with no insulation, a good rhyme was as effective as architecture. Isolation was the enemy. In winter, the village was both asylum and trap, but human company, gossip, jokes, communal complaining, kept despair from freezing solid. Women gathered to spin or bake, trading news and curses in equal measure. "Did you hear about Marta's cow?" someone would say. "It gave birth inside the house again." Laughter followed, muffled but real. Misery, when shared, became entertainment. The medieval woman's humor was dark, practical, and relentless. A good joke about lice or husbands could keep morale higher than any fire. There was no time for self-pity. Self-pity didn't boil the porridge. Instead, there was a kind of communal stoicism, the recognition that life was hard for everyone and therefore oddly fair. Hope was a fragile thing in the Middle Ages, but also the most contagious. It lived in tiny details, the first drip of thaw from the roof, the hint of daylight lasting a few minutes longer, the new lamb bleeding somewhere out in the gray. Women read the weather like scripture. A mild breeze, a softer sunbeam, omens of survival. The earth is waking, they said, long before it actually did. Hope, even premature, was fuel. Many kept track of the seasons by the saints' feasts, but others relied on more personal signs. When the cat began to shed, when the hens laid again, when their bones ached less in the morning. These were the medieval calendars, written in the language of the body and the yard. But not every mind made it intact. Prolonged cold and darkness did strange things. There were stories of people wandering into snowstorms, hearing voices, claiming to see angels or devils in the smoke. Historians call it hypothermia or malnutrition. Villagers called it the winter madness. Women, burdened with sleepless nights and endless labor, often turned to dreams for meaning. If you dreamt of green fields, spring was near. If you dreamt of running water, the thaw had begun somewhere. If you dreamt of warmth, well, that was just cruel. The line between mysticism and exhaustion was thin. Still, dreams gave them something to talk about besides frostbite. More than faith, more than superstition, the medieval woman's greatest defense was acceptance, a kind of elegant stubbornness. She didn't believe life would get easier, she believed it would continue, and that belief, however bleak, was enough. When morning came and the fire smoked and the cow mooed accusingly, she rose. Again, when the world froze solid, she adjusted her shawl and muttered, "It could be worse." When it was worse, she muttered it louder. This wasn't defeatism, it was endurance refined into philosophy. The medieval woman did not seek comfort, she sought survival with dignity and, whenever possible, a little sarcasm. Faith warmed the spirit, superstition distracted the mind, humor softened the blows. Together, they built the invisible architecture of survival, the mental hearth that burned even when the real one failed. And through all the darkness, through all that endless gray, that invisible fire never quite went out. By midwinter, the world outside was silent, but inside, it hummed with voices. When fields lay frozen and work slowed, people turned inward, toward the hearth, toward each other, and toward the only pastime that required no tools and no sunlight: talking. Gossip was the social currency of the medieval village. It was entertainment, communication, and moral policing rolled into one smoky, sarcastic package. For women, especially, it was an art form. The medieval village didn't have newsletters, but it didn't need them. Information traveled faster than disease, carried by women over fences, through doorways, and across frozen paths with the precision of divine messengers. Who had extra firewood? Who'd been seen fetching water with the blacksmith's son? Whose cow mysteriously stopped giving milk after Candlemas? The answers to these questions determined social order more effectively than any sheriff. To gossip was to survive. It wasn't idle chatter. It was intelligence gathering. Who was hungry? Who was ill? Who still had salted pork left? In a world without privacy, information was warmth. For the medieval woman, her social world was both her safety net and her stage. She knew everyone's secrets and assumed everyone knew hers. The trick wasn't to keep secrets, but to control the narrative. Winter was matchmaking season. With work slowed and people confined indoors, talk turned inevitably to marriage, the medieval version of insurance. A husband meant labor, income, protection, and, if you were lucky, a set of shoulders broad enough to block the wind. For widows, remarriage was less romance than logistics. For young women, it was the only respectable escape from their parents' overcrowded house. Courting in winter had its own peculiar rituals. Church festivals offered the rare opportunity to see someone new, or at least someone clean. At dances, men tested a woman's sturdiness by spinning her near the fire, while mothers appraised potential son-in-laws like livestock. Proposals were rarely dramatic. A few words exchanged, a dowry negotiated, and suddenly 2 people were bound together for life, or until fever, famine, or falling roofs intervened. But even within this cold pragmatism, tenderness found its way in. Couples huddled closer in bed, hands brushed at the hearth, and laughter bubbled during chores. Love, like warmth, was seldom abundant, but always cherished. In a village where everyone depended on everyone else, grudges were luxuries few could afford. If your fire went out, you'd need to borrow a coal. If your roof collapsed, you'd need your neighbor's thatch. Mutual tolerance was the only way civilization survived the winter. Still, tensions brewed as easily as ale. Fences shifted, hens wandered, and gossip occasionally curdled into feud. Medieval women were often the diplomats, smoothing tempers, trading favors, ensuring no one starved out of spite. They could recall every loaned tool, every shared loaf, every insult disguised as advice. Forgiveness, like firewood, was rationed carefully. When nights grew long, gatherings became essential. Neighbors crowded into one another's cottages for storytelling, spinning, or communal meals. These weren't parties so much as strategic alliances against boredom and frostbite. Each guest brought something: ale, bread, news, or just their body heat. Storytelling filled the hours. Myths, saints' lives, local ghost tales, all told in low voices over the crackle of the hearth. For the women, spinning wheels hummed beneath the conversation, a steady percussion behind the words. The stories weren't just distraction, they were cultural glue. Through stories, they kept memory alive, of ancestors, of lost summers, of saints who had survived worse. And if a few details grew exaggerated along the way, well, it made the night warmer. Winter flattened some social lines. Hunger was the great equalizer. But not all. The manor still loomed above the village, its stone walls colder, but its pantries fuller. Peasant women labored while noble women endured drafts in furs, and both believed the other had it easier. Yet in the dark months, even the highborn relied on the lowborn. Servants, wet nurses, midwives, spinners. Medieval women of all classes shared one unspoken alliance. They were the keepers of life while the men dreamed of war or taxes. In a season when survival depended on cooperation, women's invisible labor became the foundation of everything. And they knew it, even if no one carved it into parchment. For all the hardship, winter also brought flashes of wild joy. Feast days, carnivals, saints' festivals. Moments when the world briefly remembered to laugh. At Christmastide, fires burned high, ale flowed freely, and for one blessed week, even the poorest could eat like kings. The Festival of Fools turned hierarchy upside down. Peasants mocked priests, servants played at being lords, and everyone agreed to forget their misery until morning. For women, these days were double-edged. More work, more cooking, but also more laughter, dancing, and the fleeting illusion that life was more than toil. And perhaps that illusion was the point. By March, patience frayed. The gossip sharpened, tempers cracked, and hope became a fragile, tired thing. Food stores ran low, animals grew thin, and sickness crept in like fog. Survival wasn't guaranteed, but then again, it never was. And so women relied on what had carried them through every winter before: faith, fire, and each other. The neighbors' gossip became a lifeline, the shared bread a blessing, and the laughter a rebellion. The world outside might still be frozen, but inside, around the hearth, there was life. Noisy, smelly, absurd, and utterly unkillable. Because in the medieval world, to survive winter wasn't just to endure the cold, it was to keep the village and the human heart from freezing too.
Winter in the Middle Ages was not conquered. It was endured. Every year it arrived like an old creditor, demanding its due in frostbite, hunger, and bone-deep fatigue. And every year, somehow, the women of the age paid the debt and remained standing. The chronicles rarely mention them. The monks wrote about kings, battles, plagues, saints, never about the woman who kept the fire alive through 30 nights of wind, or who coaxed a half-frozen child back to warmth with breath and wool. Yet it was those hands, cracked and blackened with soot, that held civilization together when everything else stopped moving. Each act of survival was quiet. A bucket carried through snow, a cloak patched for the 20th time, a meal stretched from scraps, a prayer muttered into smoke. No triumphs, no miracles, just repetition, and the strange holiness of persistence. Spring never arrived suddenly. It crept in, uncertain, like a guest afraid of being sent away. The first sign was sound, dripping roofs, trickling ditches, the slow music of thaw. Then smell, the scent of earth waking from months of ice. Then color, dull at first, then bright enough to make the eyes water. The medieval woman watched it all with a suspicion born of experience.
She did not rejoice immediately. She waited. She had been tricked before by false thaws and lying sunshine. Only when the grass truly pushed through the mud, only when the hens laid again, only when her children stopped coughing, did she allow herself to believe that she had won another year. The thaw revealed everything winter had hidden: broken fences, dead animals, lost shoes, forgotten tools. The world looked like a battlefield after retreat. But amid the wreckage came renewal: seeds to plant, wool to shear, markets to reopen. Life resumed its relentless rhythm, and the memory of winter began to fade like smoke up the chimney. She did not call herself brave. She did not think of endurance as virtue. To her, it was simply living. But through her endurance, an entire age kept breathing. In surviving, she built a legacy far greater than she could imagine. Her small, stubborn acts became the invisible foundation of history. The reason villages endured, families grew, and songs were written about warmer days. When people later romanticized the Middle Ages, the chivalry, the cathedrals, the grand feasts, they forgot that all of it depended on the woman who fed the fire, milked the cow, and refused to die in February. She was not remembered by name, but she was remembered in kind. In every cottage hearth, every superstition, every whispered prayer against the cold, her spirit lingered, practical, fierce, unyielding. She taught the world that survival is not noble. It is not beautiful. It is not even fair. It is simply what must be done, and sometimes that is enough. And so, when the frost returned the next year, as it always did, she did not despair. She looked to the fire, to her children, to the same old patched cloak, and thought, "We did it once, we will do it again." Because that was the secret all along. Not courage, not faith, but repetition, the quiet rhythm of defiance. To live again and again in spite of everything. And that, in the end, was the most human victory of all. Subscribe for more.